Thank you. Thank you to the Stegner Center for inviting me here today. It's quite a turnout, and it's so far been a very, very informative conference. Really appreciate the quality of the speakers and the information being imparted here. Contrary to what you might think, I'm not here to represent the dark side. There is a light side to the utility business, although we don't always do a good job of showing it. My goal here today, though, really is to not to enter into the political fray, not enter into any of the debates or anything else that are going on, but just simply say how in one small slice of the world, which is Arizona for us, we're attempting to tackle some of the issues associated with this and bring the needed technological and resource decisions down to long-term sustainable decisions that if it improves our little corner of the world, hopefully that will just spread out and become one of the big wedges that were talked about a little bit earlier. If I could manage to work the technology here. Okay. I do represent the an investor-owned utility. As you probably know, there are investor-owned utilities and there are public utilities like municipalities in the country. I put this slide up here just to show you a fact that we have to deal with. There's a declining number of investor-owned utilities. They're not going out of style. They're not becoming obsolete. They're consolidating. And when they consolidate, as in the rest of the business world, you have larger economic resources concentrated in the industry, and that's what we're seeing. That, in part, is probably some of the result of deregulation and the competitive marketplace that we've seen. This is our company here. This is where we exist. This is Arizona and our service territory. We just last year passed the, I think it was the year before last actually, the 1 million customer mark. We have a growth rate that's about 3 times the U.S. average. We have 6,600 employees, and you can see the rest of the statistics there. The most important one for purposes of this discussion is we have the second largest generation fleet in the western U.S. So that's good news, bad news, I suppose, because what we do does matter, but we have to be very careful how we do it. And we are at a point in the West, as I'll illustrate in a few minutes, where the growth pressures are becoming very significant, and the need to add to that fleet is growing more imminent. So before we flip the switch, I want to take a look at some of the facts about energy demand and use. Again, from a utility perspective, there's been some very good information put up here on a global scale. This brings it down to reality to show some of the facts that we're dealing with in terms of our planning and how we move the electrons through the system, and that's basically illustrated here. We go from the power plant, which is basically our resource, and we distribute it over numerous facilities to get it to the consumer. So it's a very complex grid that we have to operate, maintain, and keep in balance at all times because, as most of you know, when you flip the switch, you don't want to wait a month for that order to land and somebody to turn on the light. You want it to happen right now. So when we talk about the realities and population growth in the Southwest, to put it in Terry Root's terms, I guess, this means that our section of the meat map is growing more abundant. We've got more people out there, and they're coming every day. Population growth throughout the West. I know the boosters in Arizona argue with the boosters in Nevada and chambers of commerce about who's the fastest growing in terms of numbers. But the fact of the matter is there's more people moving into the desert Southwest, and as we all know, the desert Southwest has some inherent limitations in how many people it can support, and we'll see some of that in just a moment here as we discuss how this plays out in the energy planning area. We're not only increasing our numbers, and as was pointed out here, certainly in the vehicle area with vehicle miles traveled, pointed out earlier in our discussion, we're all using more energy. We have a large appetite for it, and these numbers have not shown any sign of abating. This is notwithstanding the tremendous amount and intensity of information that's been out there and publicity about climate change, about the need to conserve, about the energy efficiency programs that have been enforced. This nonetheless remains the picture we see, and it can be quite a disturbing picture when you start thinking about how big those wedges are, how they might grow in the future. From a household consumption perspective, this is just a chart that depicts where we've gone between, in a relatively short period, 1980, back when I still had hair, up to today. And, you know, if it continues on the current path, what's projected? Now, the projected we control, albeit at some painful levels, but nonetheless, you know, this trend can't continue, obviously. There's got to be a limit that we all have to participate in making happen. Some of this is not only caused by the home sizes, it's obviously caused by the types of appliance we use and how much we use our appliances. I'm sure there's a number of people here that left their computers on at home when they came to the conference this morning and been told that it's probably more efficient to do that. In fact, it isn't. It's one of those parasitic loads that just continues to consume energy and cause the plants to burn fossil fuels to supply it. So changes in behavior, or fairly significant changes in behavior, are going to be necessary here in a not too distant future. This chart kind of puts it together. This shows the impact from our perspective of population growth coupled with energy use. They both continue to go up. And so the question we have to address is ultimately if we cannot predict how those things are going to be abated, then how do we predict what kinds of resources that we bring online and when we bring them online to make sure that we can continue to flip the switch? This is just a overall picture nationally of the resource picture as we talk here today. This is basically the resource needs going out over time, and when we hit what is kind of a critical stage, an 18% reserve margin. As you can see in the eastern New England area, particularly in areas that are constrained for power, they've hit that already, and will continue to have impacts there. And I'll show you in a little while how in the demand response area this has really driven some very dramatic impacts back there and how they're changing the way that they use energy and manage their demand response. In the West here, we're not in terribly bad shape right now. We do have some time to make decisions, but as I'll show in a minute, that time is necessary, and it's that window is declining or shortening pretty quickly. This is where our power is coming from right now. I mean, this is just a general overview from the utility sector in where it's generated. You've seen figures before that have been put up here. This is from EIA, based I think on 2006. The only thing that I think is noteworthy here is look at the size of the coal and look at the size of the renewable sector. There's quite a disparity there, and obviously the goal here over time is to change those relationships fairly significantly. So when we flip the switch, how can we be sure anything happens? That's kind of my job. That's the key for us, and you know, I'm going to give you a little background on how we do that and what some of the constraining factors are when we look at that. There are two primary factors associated with that. One is time and the other is money. But when we look at resource planning overall, we've got a number of things that have to go into that mix. And so the resource planning process, the regulatory policies, and the stakeholder meetings we have to hold in order to make a resource decision on constructing a specific resource really have to go through all these screens. If they don't go through these screens, they don't happen, or if they happen, you don't get paid for it. It's quite simple. So it is complex. It does take time to go through the planning process. Public policy weighs very heavily in this. This is contrasted with 20 years ago where the planning process was really just a least cost exercise. You lined them up together, you ran them over the life cycle, and you figured out which one cost the least. That was your choice. Those days are gone. It's a lot more complicated today. Time is one of the components I just wanted to focus on of all those various issues. Building a power plant takes time. So when we look at public policies, we look at the decisions we have to make. The decisions that have to be made 2, 3, 4, 5, and 10 years down the road are being made today. So we can't wait until then to make the decisions because you can't turn it on a dime. And I'm not proposing any one of these options is the best option. But for example, if we decide that we want to displace coal and we don't want to build those coal plants, we think nuclear is at least an interim solution. You've got 10 years to actually implement that plan. You've got to be, if you wanted that thing online in 2017, which is when a lot of the base load needs are really become quite significant here in the West, you essentially have to start making commitments today to do it. So the public policy arena and every other arena, quite frankly, needs to take into account this time element. There's a tremendous lag time in the process. Here's the delivered cost. This is the cost equation in resource planning, and this is as of right now. These numbers change, by the way, and we'll go through a couple more slides here, and I'll show you the add-ons to these costs. But this just gives you an idea as we sit here today what the relative costs of these various technologies are. As you see, solar is fairly high, but you're going to see that that horse race begin to be won by solar as we get into some of the other costs, such as fuel and O&M. Geothermal is fairly high in terms of initial capital cost as well, and that's all this is here is initial capital cost, by the way, and then coal and gas. Nuclear is on there, but you know, that's just a wild guess right now. Nobody's built one in a long time, and no one's quite sure what that cost is. So it sits there in the middle of the pack, but it could end up at the top or the bottom very easily. Now when we take the delivered cost and we add in the O&M component, O&M is the operating maintenance, what it takes to do the periodic replacements and maintenance and upkeep of the plant. You see things starting to move here a little bit. Solar is still relatively high right now. Geothermal is fairly high because of the geothermal structures or facilities. They tend to operate in a very caustic environment and have a lot of replacement costs associated with piping and so on and so forth. That's improved over the years with what they call the twice-through technology that doesn't use the caustic water directly for steam, but they still have a relatively high O&M cost. Now when we put in the fuel costs, this is the most dramatic one here. You begin to see what's happening. Gas, which was at the bottom, starts creeping up, and let me tell you a couple of assumptions that are in that number right now. This is based on a long-term fundamental forecast that is a consensus of all the geniuses out there that forecast gas prices. They've always had it wrong in the past. So how good that number is, I don't know, but I'm guessing, and I'd be willing to put money on it if I were a gambling person or we were in Vegas right now, that it's going to be higher, not lower. So you can begin to see how those gas plants, which look like the least cost alternative, begin to creep up. The volatility in the gas market is tremendous. We see prices double within very short periods of time and for very short periods of the day. Those costs get passed through, ratepayers get upset, they want action now. So this is a fact in the planning process that has to be taken into account, and this is why least cost planning doesn't work the way it used to, because if it did, we'd probably be building gas plants and just kicking the can down the road here. So let me talk a little bit about the renewable resources, at least from our neck of the woods and what we're doing right now. This is a slide that I know a lot of our executives are very proud of and stand up and hoot and holler about, but you know, in the overall mix of things, we need to be real. This is a tiny sliver of our resource portfolio right now, and I'll explain those reasons in a moment. But we are very big on the wind thing. We're doing RFPs out there. We've got actually over 100 megawatts now, closer to 200 megawatts signed up for wind. Most of it comes out of New Mexico. The one thing about wind that was mentioned earlier, of course, is it's intermittent, but more importantly for us, we're not blessed all over the western U.S. with the same amount of wind and the constancy of it. So we find very low quality wind opportunities in Arizona relative to some of the other places like New Mexico, which means we have to build transmission lines, of course, to bring it in. The landfill gas, which is not going to put a big dent overall. The thing that is relatively attractive about that, I think, is it's a responsible thing to do. We generate a lot of waste, and because we generate a lot of waste, it turns into methane and goes up in the atmosphere, which I'm sure the scientists in the audience know is much worse in terms of global warming than just CO2. So we can at least utilize and convert that landfill gas into something more useful with hopefully less consequences to the environment. And then, of course, solar, and solar is where we shine, so to speak, excuse the pun. But that's the one that holds huge promise, and I'll go over just a moment where we're at in that arena. We talked about mandates a little bit earlier, and I'll tell you right now, you can poll the executives and all the workers in the utility industry, and you'll get as many opinions as there are people about whether or not mandates work, how they should work, should they be federal, should they be local, and so on. Mandates do work. Mandates do have a place. There's no question about it, because it does spur the market. It moves where you don't otherwise have an economic incentive to move. It moves you into the areas of technological advancement and so on, but they do have some serious limits that have to be taken into account. Let me just kind of describe briefly our Arizona mandate right now. This is what it is. It's essentially a 15% requirement by 2025, probably modest by any standard, quite frankly. That is energy, by the way, not capacity. That was just implemented here in 2007, and as you can see, based on our existing portfolio, we'd fall well short of that and have some real difficulties both with our regulators and otherwise down the road here. But we recently signed a contract for what we think is a promising next generation for utilities, at least, in central station development for solar projects. This is a Solano, we call it Solano Generating Station. It's a 280 megawatt project that we have signed a contract for the offtake. We're not building it. Abengoa, a Spanish company, is actually going to build it, and they're in this sector big time. And so we have signed a contract with them. We expect it to come online in 4 years. And this is a good project for us for many reasons, not the least of which, of course, the environmental benefits. But I think one of the biggest benefits right here is this picture, because what it does, it not only meets the mandates, which is all well and good, that's fine, we have to do that. What it does is it exceeds the mandates, and it sends a signal both to the public and to our own management that the mandates are fine, but they're not enough. You got to figure out a way to get beyond the mandates. You got to figure out a way to get into the market and make these viable resource options from a resource planning perspective. And this is a first step in that direction, and that's why I think it's relatively exciting. Let me take a look here at, very quickly, another side of the equation from a utility perspective. These are the demand side options. This is how do we put a dent in that increasing demand picture that we saw a little bit earlier. Utilities, most utilities in the country have some sort of efficiency, energy efficiency, either mandates or programs. Some of them are fairly effective, some of them less so. They vary state by state and locality by locality. They tend to be very politicized by the local commissions, and sometimes a little bit difficult to measure all the benefits from it. But generally, what we see at the residential level, the high, in the West at least, the very high potential for replacement of HVAC, air conditioning units, to higher efficiency units, and then the various consumer products and appliances that enable efficiency, which include the CFLs, which are the fluorescent light bulbs that most of you are probably familiar with by now. And in the business area, of course, lighting, cooling, refrigeration, and motors. These are all programs that we push to the customers right now with little economic incentive to do it, because we simply have to pass that cost through, and until we get the ability to recover it, we can't pass it along. You know, it's kind of an uphill battle with consumers right now. Market penetration is one of the difficulties in this area. However, having said that, the efficiency programs typically are lower cost than supply side options, new generation resources. Actually, they delay, if not foreclose the need, they certainly delay the need for new generation, and what this allows is the technology curve to sort of proceed a little bit more before we call up that next technology decision, and hopefully there's a benefit from that. Obviously, it's clean. You know, the cleanest megawatt you can have is the one you don't produce. So that's the theory there. And of course, as we see higher and higher prices, and we will, if we do nothing, we'll see higher and higher prices because of the cost of fuel. Customers more and more demand the ability to manage that somehow, and they're crying for it. And as prices start hitting the kinds of increases we see in the near-term horizon, it's going to be absolutely essential that they have some tools at their disposal to conserve. So if we encourage investment in energy efficiency, what do we need to do? I mean, how do we achieve that? Well, again, from a utility perspective, we have a disincentive to do it, because as we encourage conservation, it doesn't take much to realize we sell less energy. At some point, we have incurred fixed costs to supply that energy, so we need to recover that fixed cost somehow or write it off. I don't believe in what they call kicker incentives for utilities where they get an extra return on investment in energy efficiency. They should simply be held neutral in the market for energy efficiency, and we need another pricing paradigm to achieve that. And we need to work very hard on measuring the real improvements and effects of energy efficiency. Often we see a program launched, it gets out there, everybody's happy about it, we cut ribbons, everybody gets their picture in the paper, and then a month later, the light bulbs have burned out or been thrown in the trash, and we're back to the old incandescent or whatever. So we need an ongoing way to measure, monitor, and maybe to some extent enforce those energy efficiency measures. On the revenue side, I won't go through this slide in any detail, but this is a term that was used a little bit earlier, and that was the idea of decoupling. That's what utilities really need in the energy efficiency area, is some mode of decoupling, which says that we're not going to incent you to generate more megawatt hours. We're going to incent you to actually conserve megawatt hours, or we're at least not going to disincent you from doing that. So that's a little different rate structure way of doing it. And as you can see, basically what it does is it plugs in the lost revenue component there, so the utility becomes somewhat indifferent and hopefully is on the side of the environment and actually promotes energy efficiency at the end of the day. An area that I think is getting too little response, and maybe justifiably so from a warming perspective, because it's not altogether clear how much conservation results from demand response. But it is right now, in my estimation at least, an area where we have invested way too little as a society, and in fact has a huge impact on how we use energy and how we demand new generation resources. And just for those of you that don't know, demand response is defined here under FERC definition that was put out in 2006. It's the planning, implementation, and monitoring of activities designed to encourage customers to modify patterns of electricity usage, including the timing and level of electricity demand. A simple example of that would be a demand response that would turn off your air conditioner at certain points in the day when demand on the overall grid was the highest, thereby allowing the electric utility to avoid turning on another generator, hopefully ultimately resulting in an energy savings from that, as well as avoiding or at least delaying the need to build additional generation. There are several types of demand response here. The direct load control is the easiest one. It's the easiest to implement. It's the most cost-effective, and it's the most underutilized right now. But it's actually installing enabling devices on consumers and businesses that allow the cycling of air conditioners in particular, but also other appliances. It certainly is done. California, I know, is a leader in the West in employing these technologies. And does have some fairly impressive results from it. But even in their case, they say that there is far more potential here. There's the scheduled load control, of course. We just say a certain time of the day, everybody's going to turn down their thermostat. And then there is actual load response. And ultimately, this moves into what we call dynamic pricing, where a price signal is sent to the consumer and says, here's what's going to cost you to consume energy for this hour of the day. And the consumer will then make a decision whether or not to utilize that. That's probably more practical in a commercial context and industrial complex than it is for the residential. Although residences can employ, ultimately, down the road, enabling technologies through appliance chips and other things that would automatically take that reading from the utility and monitor or modulate that appliance's use in connection with a price signal from the market. So when we take a look at what the impact of demand response is on the vertically integrated utility costs, we see that there's a sweet spot here. There's a crossover. We're nowhere near it, and what we need is to make sure that we have regulatory programs and public policies that take this into account and make sure that that economic trade-off, that we've at least hit that spot. That's before you have to get to any kind of subsidies or other funding mechanisms to make it happen. And that's why I say it is a very underutilized concept. The benefits, as I indicated, are the lower, it lowers the cost on the supply side with respect to supply side options. The delay of generation gives us more breathing room. More breathing room means more technologies, hopefully, will be farther along. So every year you can delay making that resource decision, hopefully, is a benefit. Again, it's clean. The megawatt you don't use is the cleanest one you can produce. And it does, once again, put another tool in the hands of customers who are facing this rate tsunami, if you will, to try and manage their consumption. Not only how much they consume, but the time of day that they consume it. Here is the participation level in various areas of the country, and I wanted to point out Connecticut there. When you see they're looking at 6% load reductions in a relatively small area, but that corresponds to that red spot you saw on the map. The value of limiting your demand in that market has become very high, so consequently the demand response programs have a much larger effect. Other areas where the either demand response is not priced accurately or capacity demand is not priced very efficiently, or they have just an abundance of capacity. You don't see the market penetration is dramatic there, but there is a tremendous amount of potential left here, particularly in the West, as I said. Well, this is overall the U.S. demand has been estimated through the U.S. Department of Energy in one of their latest assessments. I think it was done in 2006, where we're at, what the potential is and what the actual is. And that was these are fairly old numbers. I think that potential has gone up substantially since then. And so the real key thing here, though, is the difference between what we're achieving and what the potential is when you talk about a cost-effective means of reducing energy demand. Implementing demand response requires a significant amount of investment, as everything does, of course. One of the big investments is in metering. Meters have to be installed that can actually be controlled at a central point so that the energy use in that particular facility is managed. It has to take readings differently than existing meters do and so on. So it's a new technology. Most of them have to communicate through some sort of wireless communication with the utility in a different way. So there's a substantial investment required. I think in California, I don't know if it's $1 or $2 billion has been committed to install meters that will, among other things, facilitate more demand response or better demand response. This slide's interesting because this was a slide that I picked up. I only partially have permission to use it, so I hope I don't get sued. But it's a 2006 presentation that was made by Utilipoint, Patty Harper at Utilipoint. And this is based on a survey. I don't know how scientific it is. I don't know what the margin of error is, but this is polling the regulators and what their willingness is to pay for demand response. Now, keep in mind that this is still one of the most cost-effective options out there with underutilized potential. And look at the number of those polled from a public policy perspective that would not be willing to give full recovery for the cost. You simply won't get there from here with that kind of attitude. So. Let me talk briefly about some of the initiatives we have going on here. I think that I did want to do an advertisement because that's not what this conference is about. But I did want to mention a couple of programs from the perspective that as a utility, we don't have research and development departments. We don't employ scientists and so on and so forth. Our job is pretty simple. It's kind of boring. It's moving electrons from one place to the other and collecting money for it. But the fact is we do participate in as many programs as we can economically. And some of the programs we have right now, we're doing a joint project with Department of Energy and some others on the biofuels, which takes one of our power plants, takes the carbon emissions from the stack, runs it through a solar process with algae that we collect from use our cooling ponds to collect from. And we grow the algae essentially in the desert sun, and then we convert it to a biofuel. We take the starches from it and use it to make ethanol, which I know is not a particularly favorite subject, but at least we're not growing corn to do it. And third, takes the protein mass from that process and uses that to feed some of us on the meat map. So there's a technology there is well along. It's really more a matter of scale than it is technical issues. We have district cooling, which is kind of the ultimate demand response. Well, downtown Phoenix area right now through one of our affiliates is supplied with cold, chilled water throughout the hot summer days. This includes the ballpark, which is our dome ballpark in downtown Phoenix. They don't call upon the grid to meet that cooling demand. They cool it with that chilled water. That water, in turn, is chilled at night off peak when we might otherwise have to turn down a baseload plant and start it back up and operate it at a less efficient level, both from a cost perspective and emissions perspective, and allows it to run, chill that water, cool it overnight, and then operate the cooling system during the day to cool the downtown Phoenix area. So we supply not only the stadium downtown, but we supply a number of the major office and government buildings down there through an underground piping system. So the other project we have going on right now is a carbon to substitute natural gas project out at our coal facilities to take a look at some of our coal quality and see whether or not that's a viable technology and how cost effective and emissions friendly that would be. And of course our efficiency lighting program, subsidizing light bulbs, it's basically just giving the manufacturer a subsidy to sell the CFLs for $1 a piece. And hopefully consumers will put them in because there's huge amounts of efficiency savings there available if people will just get over the resistance to, one, paying the price of a CFL bulb, and two, the different kind of light that it throws. And I just urge you for more information. I think we're relatively well postured as a responsible utility in this sector, given the resources we have to work with. If any of you are interested in reading more about these projects, you're free to contact me or get on the website, which I've got up here at it's pinnaclewest.com. And we put out an environmental and corporate responsibility report every day that has a lot of the technical information about these and other projects that we've got ongoing now. So let me close this off. I know it's close to lunch here, and I don't want to hold people up. From a utility perspective, here's the thing. I mean, I think the call to action is necessary. I mean, we have to continue to get that message out to the public, both from a utility perspective and from the public policy and the environmental community. People will begin to believe it. Eventually, Terry Rook can go to any conference in the country and not feel like she's playing an away game. And so that, I think, is something we just have to continually work on. There's no single approach to this. I know this has been said. It's a multitude of things. It's working on the supply side. We'd love to get rid of coal plants too because they're expensive, they're hard to operate, and they just smell bad. But at the same time, we're not going to. We're going to have to continue to deal with it. So we need good rational policies to figure out how you minimize and reduce those impacts so that we can get those, at least in the interim period, until we have the renewable sector essentially take over all of our generation portfolio, not adding to the problem. This is a change on scale. I mean, this is not something that's going to happen overnight. It will take time, but we can't wait to implement the policies. We can't wait to articulate, make them clear, put them in place, and give the right signals to members of the public, to the markets, and to the utilities. So you say, okay, now go. It's time to start, and it's time to really make some commitments here. And the policies and mandates that we have, they need to do a couple things. First of all, they need to be geared to facilitate market participation in these things ultimately. You start with a mandate, you start with subsidies. You want to be able to phase that out so that the market can step in and actually supply what's needed. And they have to be very clear, clearly articulated, and they have to be practical and acceptable to society as a whole. And they've got to be consistent with the realities of the marketplace. And I'll just add one final note on this discussion between state and federal. I've always been more on the federal side than state. That's my view, not my company's view necessarily. I think at state level controls, you cannot achieve what we have to achieve with a patchwork of different states with different ideologies and political pressures trying to push this through. It just simply won't happen. And the moment you have one state that feels economically displaced from another state because of the way they are implementing, they will back off, because the full cost of what we have to do has not even begun to hit the consumer yet. And when it does, there'll be tremendous political pressure at the local levels to back off on the whole renewable effort. So while we see a lot of favorable publicity now, I'm afraid it's not going to be sustainable at a local level when the real cost of that starts to hit. So we just need to take that into account. And with that, I'll close. Are there any?
I think we have time for 2, maybe 3 questions.
Do you give special rates for people who use ground source heat pumps in Arizona?
I don't think that's listed as part of the efficiency group right now. It depends on their SEER. If they do represent a higher SEER, they would get an incentive for that because we subsidize those.
In that list of costs that you gave us for the different energy sources, wind was not included. And we read recently that the Austin, Texas region has developed wind sufficiently to where their costs are now competitive with all the others. What is your view on wind?
We like wind. We'll buy all of the wind we can take. Our regulatory mandate right now pegs the cap on the price that we pay for any renewables at 125% of avoided cost.
How do the costs compare with the others that you gave us?
The in-place costs, they compare with, I would say, geothermal. They're right on target with that, except the O&M is a lot less. So since we don't build wind, we buy or we contract for wind, the capital costs are a little bit, they're not as transparent to me as some of the other technologies, and that's why I'm hedging my answer here.
All right.
But they are very favorable.
And sorry, our last question here.
Okay.
Do you see a role at all for individual homeowners with small photovoltaic panels on their roofs generating their own power and putting it back in the grid?
In fact, part of our mandate does include a distributable portion of that. I think 30% of that portion has to be residential. You know, to answer your question, do I see that being an appreciable impact on what we have to do? Right now, looking out, I don't. I think what's important about that program is to make sure the consumers have that option. It's a very expensive option. It's by far, if we put it up on that chart, in terms of delivered cost, the highest delivered cost of any option we have. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It should be out there for the consumers, but they're going to need credits and subsidies, either in the way of tax credits or other subsidies, to really implement that in any meaningful fashion. The other difficulty we have with residential distributed level generation is the ability to monitor and verify, because those things tend to break over time or they get disconnected. They're on the roof, they've been paid the subsidy, so somebody has to go out and enforce and make sure they continue to operate. Having said that, at the institutional level, we're very high on that. In fact, one of our biggest non-utility, well, our utility customer also, but on the non-utility side is Arizona State University, which we're installing some very large solar arrays on their new parking garages and stuff to give them that capability. So commercially and industrial, it's probably much better potential than residential. Thank you.